Thanks for joining us on 9 News Plus. I'm Chris Bianchi. A violent insurrection in Brazil led to supporters of former Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro overtaking the country's Supreme Court, Congress, and presidential palace in the country's capital of Brasilia back on January the 8th. For many of us here in America, it probably reminds us a lot of what happened back on January the 6th of 2021 when supporters of former President Donald Trump stormed American Congress. Joining us now is Oliver Kaplan, an associate professor at the University of Denver's Corbell School for International Studies and the director of the Latin America Center for more about what happened in Brazil and some similarities. So, Professor, thanks so much for joining us here today.
So yeah, there are a number of similarities between what happened in the U.S. and what's happened in Brazil. And in Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro, the outgoing president, while he didn't actively call for an insurrection on January 8th in Brazil, as far as we know, he did really set the stage for the type of unrest that occurred. So he made a number of statements undermining the integrity of the election, raising claims of voter fraud, claims of corruption against his opponent, Mr. Lula. And so there were a number of ways that even though Bolsonaro had removed from the scene, had moved to Florida shortly after the inauguration, his supporters were riled up by some of those previous statements. In addition to that, you see a lot of disinformation and misinformation on social media and other sources similar to what we've seen with the January 6th protests, or the January 6th insurrection. So it's still unclear how all the events in Brazil unfolded. As we know, in the U.S., we had a January 6th commission, which only now 2 years later turned in its report. And so we're going to have to see in the coming days how the movement in Brazil came together.
What's been the overall public reaction to this in Brazil?
So it's a little hard to say. There's a bit of a mixed reaction. There's in general not a lot of confidence in the democratic system, but overall, from what we can see, there's largely been condemnation and support for the democratic institutions of Brazil, which is quite encouraging. And so we'll hope that lasts and grows. And I think that's the challenge for all the democracies in the region, including in the U.S., to continue to support confidence in the democratic system, even after these types of events. And so it looks like in Brazil, most of the institutional players have come together around supporting the democratic system.
Tell us about the riot itself on January the 8th in Brasilia. What exactly happened? And you kind of mentioned some of the background to it, but how exactly did it start?
So it looks like a number of activists that were supportive of Jair Bolsonaro had various aims in mind, hoping to perhaps overthrow the recently inaugurated President Lula da Silva. And they seem to have a lot of disinformation or misinformation on social media, coordinating plans, perhaps hoping that the military would come and support them to overthrow the new president. And fortunately, that didn't happen. But it seems like at the same time, the security institutions in Brazil did not expect the volume of people, well over 1,000 people that came out and broke through into the offices.
So you mentioned how Bolsonaro is in Florida right now, where he's kind of essentially camped out after he left power at the start of the year. Could he be charged in this case for perhaps inciting things? What's going to be the perhaps threat to him? Is he in legal jeopardy in Brazil?
So it's not clear yet. He could be. It sounds like there are a number of investigations that are starting to look at his role. So it's not clear yet what's gonna happen there. So it's still being looked into.
Okay. I guess when it comes, you mentioned the public mood overall, how it's a little perhaps split up. Are things in Brazil similar to America in the sense where things are kind of divisive and politicized, or is there a bit more, I don't know, unity, or is there a difference in public sentiment in Brazil compared to here?
I think there's a similar level of polarization. You could see that in the election results. Mr. Lula won by only about a margin of 2%, so a fairly close election. And Bolsonaro being in power for 4 years really galvanized a lot of supporters against his opponents and against the political system, the institutionalized system in Brazil. And so you, on the other hand, you had this president in Mr. Lula come back kind of like a blast from the past. So he'd been president earlier in the 2000s. One of his successors was then President Dilma Rousseff. And so that he came back in the scene, but he had been under investigations for corruption and was eventually cleared of those and able to run. But you could see the polarization on both sides, the people on the left, in a sense, with Lula, and then the Bolsonaro, the more conservative strain.
And now, unfortunately, this is not the only Latin American country right now experiencing major unrest. I know Peru is in the midst of a divisive, high-profile bit of political unrest as well. The jailing of a former, was a former president. Is there something wider happening across the continent, or are these kind of isolated incidents in different countries?
So good question. Yeah, so there are a number of larger trends happening. One of them is Latin America just happens to be one of the most unequal regions in the world. So there's a lot of inequality because of that, which is sort of a foundation of some of this polarization, with wealthier elites and other people struggling to get by. Another thing that we're seeing is really kind of a longer effect of COVID-19, the COVID-19 pandemic. So that really just caused a lot of economic and political shockwaves around the world. And one of those effects was that there was really an anti-incumbent movement in a lot of places. So people acting out against the politician or the party in power, mainly because of the bad conditions that they were not able to improve right away. And so there's this kind of anti-incumbent sentiment, which we're seeing in Latin America, for example, with Castillo in Peru, but in other countries as well. In some sense, President Joe Biden suffered some of that impulse in the midterms. I mean, he might have done better, he might have done worse, but a lot of people were saddling him with blame for inflation and other kind of longer term effects from the pandemic. Another thing we're seeing is that in the past year or so, there have been a lot of left-wing governments that have come into power, left-wing leaders, leftist leaders. So what we're seeing now is, in a sense, a reaction from the right. So there's a response from the right side of politics, the more conservative side, to try to push back against the leftist trend. So there was a leftist trend in Latin America in the 2000s, and this is sort of a new left. And so we're seeing, in a sense, these leftist reformers coming in and then some pushback against them.
Any final thoughts about this from a broad perspective?
Yeah, so I think today on the Martin Luther King Jr. holiday, his words really ring true. And one of my favorite quotes of his is he said, "Those who love peace must learn to organize as effectively as those who love war." And I think the main sentiment from that is really, that everyone wants to push for political change, but it really should be done nonviolently, and that there's some people that may be willing to use less than nonviolent methods. And in a sense, the people who believe in the democratic system need to organize in a nonviolent way to make sure that democratic processes remain strong.
Certainly a good bit of advice and takeaway here. But Professor, thank you so much for your time. Oliver Kaplan, an associate professor at the University of Denver's Corbell School for International Studies and the director of the Latin America Center. Thanks so much for joining us here on 90s Plus today.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks for having me.